The Galactic Federation Academy, a shining beacon of interspecies cooperation, where the brightest minds from across the cosmos gather to learn the finer points of not blowing themselves up. You'd think that'd be a given, but apparently some species need a refresher course. Enter Professor Kaboom. Yes, that's his actual name. And no, the irony is not lost on anyone. A human from the infamous Deathworld Earth. He's here to teach basic explosive safety and handling because nothing says safety quite like a human handling high explosives. Am I right? The classroom was a masterpiece of over-engineering. Blast-resistant walls, energy shields, and enough fail-safes to make a paranoid AI blush. The alien students filed in, a veritable rainbow of appendages and exoskeletons. There were the jellyfish-like Floatians, who looked like they'd dissolve if you so much as sneezed in their direction. The rock-solid Granites, whose idea of a light snack was a bowl of gravel. And let's not forget the Gaseous Ones who, well, let's just say the classroom had excellent ventilation. As the last student settled into place, which for the Gaseous Ones meant picking a corner to loiter in, the door burst open. In strode Professor Kaboom, a walking contradiction of safety gear and barely contained enthusiasm. He wore a blindingly orange hazmat suit because subtlety is for species that don't live on planets actively trying to kill them. "Good morning, class," he bellowed, his voice muffled by his helmet but still managing to rattle a few exoskeletons. "Welcome to Don't Blow Yourself Up 101. I'm Professor Kaboom. And yes, before you ask, that is my real name. My parents had a sense of humor, or they were psychic. The jury's still out on that one." A nervous titter rippled through the room. The Floatians' gelatinous bodies quivered with what might have been laughter or sheer terror. It was hard to tell the difference. "Now, who's ready to learn about the fascinating world of things that go boom?" Professor Kaboom clapped his hands together, the sound echoing ominously in the reinforced room. A Granite student raised a craggy appendage. "Excuse me, Professor, but isn't the point of this class to avoid explosions?" The professor's helmet tilted to one side. Excellent question. You see, to avoid explosions, you must first understand explosions. It's like dancing with a particularly feisty partner. You need to know all their moves before you can successfully, not dance with them. The Granite blinked its crystalline eyes, clearly regretting its life choices. "Let's start with the basics, shall we?" Professor Kaboom strode to a nearby table, upon which sat an array of innocuous-looking objects. "Can anyone tell me which of these everyday items could be used to create an explosive device?" The class stared at the table in silence. There was a pen, a data pad, a small potted plant, and what looked suspiciously like a sandwich. A brave Floatian extended a wobbly tentacle. "Surely not the plant, Professor." Professor Kaboom let out a laugh that would have sent lesser beings running for the hills. "Oh, my dear gelatinous friend, you'd be surprised. In the hands of a creative Deathworlder, anything can be a weapon. This little beauty," he gestured to the plant, "is a species native to Earth called Creeping Charlie Harmless, right? Wrong, its leaves contain a compound that, when properly processed, can be used as a low-grade explosive. And let's not even get started on what you can do with the roots." The Floatian retracted its tentacle so quickly it nearly turned itself inside out. "But don't worry," the professor continued, oblivious to the growing horror in the room. "We won't be making any actual explosives today. That's next week's lesson." A collective gasp echoed through the classroom. The Gaseous Ones condensed slightly in shock. "Today we'll be focusing on identification and safety protocols. After all, you can't disarm a bomb if you mistake it for a breakfast burrito." He paused, looking around the room. "That's a joke, by the way. Please laugh." The class obliged with a chorus of nervous chuckles, clicks, and in the case of the Gaseous Ones, polite whooshes. "Now, let's talk about the 3 C's of explosive safety: caution, containment, and more caution. Can't be too careful, folks." As Professor Kaboom launched into a detailed explanation of proper handling techniques, complete with wildly exaggerated hand gestures, the students found themselves caught between fascination and fear. It was like watching a supernova up close, breathtakingly beautiful, but with the very real possibility of instant vaporization. "Remember," he said, holding up a small vial of liquid, "even the most harmless-looking substances can pack a punch. This little vial contains a compound that, when mixed with the right catalyst, could level this entire building." The Granite student from earlier raised its appendage again, this time with less confidence. "Professor, is it wise to bring such dangerous materials into a classroom?" Professor Kaboom waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. This is perfectly safe. Watch." Before anyone could react, he uncorked the vial and took a hearty swig. The class erupted into chaos. The Floatians lost all cohesion, splattering against their desks in panic. The Granites curled into defensive balls, their rocky exteriors scraping against the floor. The Gaseous Ones expanded rapidly, filling their corner of the room with a fog of anxiety. Professor Kaboom watched the pandemonium with bemused interest, still holding the empty vial. After a few moments of frantic screaming and whooshing, he cleared his throat. "Ahem, class. Class." The noise died down, replaced by a tense silence punctuated only by the occasional nervous gurgle. "As I was about to explain before you all decided to reenact a scene from a disaster holovid, This vial contained nothing more than a nutritional supplement, perfectly harmless, unless you count the utterly foul taste. He smacked his lips distastefully. The point, my panicky pupils, is that appearances can be deceiving. In the world of explosives, assumptions can be deadly. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. The Floatians began to reassemble themselves, the Granites uncurled, and the Gaseous Ones condensed back to their normal density. Now Professor Kaboom continued, seemingly invigorated by the near-death experience of his students. Let's move on to something really exciting, the chemistry of combustion. For the next hour, the class was treated to a whirlwind tour of humanity's favorite pastime, making things go boom. Professor Kaboom's enthusiasm was infectious, even if it did occasionally border on maniacal. He covered everything from simple chemical reactions to the intricacies of plasma containment, all while peppering his lecture with anecdotes that made the students question the sanity of the entire human race. And that's why you should never, ever try to juggle antimatter canisters. Trust me, it only ends in tears, and possibly the creation of a small black hole. He paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. Actually, that was a pretty cool weekend. The Granite student, who had apparently appointed itself as the voice of reason, or at least the voice of please stop, you're scaring us, spoke up again. Professor, I must admit I'm having trouble understanding the practical applications of this knowledge. When would we ever need to handle such dangerous materials? Professor Kaboom's helmet swiveled towards the student, and even though they couldn't see his face, they could practically feel the manic grin. Ah, my rocky friend, that's where you're wrong. The universe is a dangerous place, full of volatile substances and unstable reactions. By understanding the principles of explosives, you're not just learning how to blow things up, you're learning how to prevent things from blowing up. He strode to the center of the room, arms spread wide. Imagine you're on a deep space mission and your ship's reactor starts to overload. Without this knowledge, you'd be space dust faster than you can say oops, but with it, you might just save your crew and complete your mission. The class murmured thoughtfully. Even the skeptical Granite had to admit the professor had a point. Plus Kaboom added with a chuckle, it makes for one hell of a party trick. You haven't lived until you've seen a Centaurian's face when you light their birthday cake with a controlled fusion reaction. As the laughter and confused whooshing died down, a small, timid voice piped up from the back of the room. It belonged to a whisper, a species known for their quiet demeanor and general aversion to anything louder than a gentle breeze. Professor, it squeaked, barely audible even in the now silent classroom. What about those of us who, well, don't particularly like explosions? Professor Kaboom's helmet tilted to one side, giving him the appearance of a curious, slightly unhinged puppy. Don't like explosions? My dear Whisper, that's like saying you don't like breathing. Explosions are a fundamental force of the universe. They birth stars, forge planets. And if my last attempt at baking is any indication, they can also create some truly spectacular kitchen disasters. The Whisper seemed to shrink even further into itself, which was impressive considering it was already about the size of a teacup. But fear not, my sound-sensitive friend, the professor continued, his voice softening. Relatively speaking, it was still loud enough to make the whisper vibrate slightly. Understanding explosions doesn't mean you have to love them. It means you have the power to control them, to prevent them, to harness their energy for good. It's about respect, not adoration. He paused, then added with a chuckle, though I'll admit, a healthy appreciation for a good kaboom doesn't hurt. Builds character. The whisper nodded hesitantly, though whether in agreement or simply to stop its molecules from rattling apart was anyone's guess. Now then, Professor Kaboom clapped his hands together, causing half the class to flinch. Who's ready for a practical demonstration? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the students exchanged nervous glances. The Floatians began to look distinctly less gel-like and more liquid-like, as if preparing to make a quick escape through the nearest drain. Oh, come now, the professor chided, noticing their trepidation. Where's your sense of adventure? Your thirst for knowledge, your burning desire to see things? Well, burn. A gaseous one near the front of the room condensed just enough to form words. Professor, with all due respect, your idea of adventure seems to align closely with our idea of imminent doom. Professor Kaboom let out a belly laugh that reverberated through his suit. Imminent doom? Nonsense. I'll have you know that I've only ever been directly responsible for 3 minor apocalypses, and I'm pretty sure at least 2 of those were accidents. This did little to reassure the class. Besides, he continued, undeterred by the looks of horror on his students' faces, or in the case of the Gaseous Ones, the way they were slowly seeping towards the air vents, this demonstration is perfectly safe. Probably. Maybe look, at least 60% safe. And that's a passing grade in most educational systems. Before anyone could voice further objections or make a break for the emergency exits, Professor Kaboom strode to a large, ominous-looking machine in the corner of the room. It was a hulking mass of metal and blinking lights, with more warning labels than a toxic jungle tour guide. This, my dear students, is the kaboominator 9000. Don't ask about the first 8,999 versions. Let's just say they're the reason I'm no longer allowed within 50 light years of the Crab Nebula. He began flipping switches and turning dials with the practiced ease of someone who's caused more explosions than most species have had hot dinners. The machine hummed to life, emitting a soft glow that somehow managed to be both soothing and terrifying. Now pay attention, because this is important, Professor Kaboom said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. What you're about to see is a controlled demonstration of various explosive reactions. The key word here is controlled. In the field of explosives research, control is everything. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention, and he trailed off, leaving the horrifying possibilities to the students' imaginations. The Granite student, ever the voice of reason, raised a trembling appendage. And what, Professor? Professor Kaboom's helmet swiveled towards the Granite, and even through the tinted visor, the gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. And you get to write a really exciting paper on what not to do. Now, who's ready to science? Without waiting for a response, which was probably for the best, as the only sounds coming from the class were whimpers and the soft whoosh of Gaseous Ones trying to escape through microscopic cracks in the walls. Professor Kaboom pressed a large red button on the kaboominator 9000. For a moment, nothing happened. The students held their breath except for the Gaseous Ones, who didn't have breath to hold and instead just sort of condensed anxiously. Then, with a soft pop, a small holographic display flickered to life in the center of the room. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, Professor Kaboom announced with a flourish, I present to you the miracle of controlled nuclear fusion. The hologram showed a swirling mass of plasma contained within a magnetic field. Tiny particles zipped around, occasionally colliding in brilliant flashes of light. It was, the students had to admit, rather beautiful. This, the professor explained, his voice filled with awe, is the same process that powers stars. The raw energy of creation, tamed by science and human ingenuity. Of course, if the containment field were to fail, it would release enough energy to vaporize this entire building and leave a crater visible from orbit. But don't worry, that only happened once during testing, and we were able to pass it off as an unusually enthusiastic fireworks display. The class watched in fascinated horror as Professor Kaboom manipulated the controls, showing how even minute changes could affect the stability of the reaction. It was like watching someone juggle antimatter, mesmerizing, but with the constant undercurrent of, oh God, we're all going to die. Now, let's move on to something a bit more terrestrial, Professor Kaboom said, pressing another button. The fusion reaction faded away, replaced by a new hologram. This one showed a familiar-looking vial of liquid. Recognize this, class? It's the same harmless nutritional supplement I drank earlier, but watch what happens when we introduce a catalyst. He manipulated the controls, and a drop of another substance fell into the virtual vial. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a blinding flash and a thunderous roar, the hologram erupted into a massive fireball. The class recoiled in unison. The Floatians lost cohesion again, splattering against their desks. The Granites instinctively formed a protective circle, their rocky bodies scraping against each other with a sound like gravel in a blender. The Gaseous Ones expanded so rapidly they set off the room's pressure alarms. Professor Kaboom, meanwhile, was practically bouncing with excitement. Isn't it magnificent? The raw power, the primal force of nature unleashed. This, my students, is why proper labeling and storage procedures are so crucial. Imagine if I had accidentally used this as creamer in my morning coffee. A Floatian, having partially reassembled itself, gurgled something that sounded suspiciously like, I think I need to change careers. Oh, come now, Professor Kaboom chided. Where's your sense of scientific curiosity? This is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the really exciting stuff yet. The temperature in the room dropped another few degrees as the students collectively wondered what could possibly be more exciting than miniature suns and coffee creamer from hell. For our next demonstration, the professor continued, blissfully unaware of the growing panic in the room, we're going to explore the fascinating world of exotic matter. The Granite student, who by now had accepted its role as the class's designated voice of reason, or at least the voice of please, for the love of all that's holy, stop, raised a trembling appendage. Professor, when you say exotic matter, you don't mean antimatter, strangelets, quantum black holes, Professor Kaboom finished, his voice brimming with barely contained glee. Oh, my dear Rocky friend, we're going to cover all of that and more. After all, you can't call yourself a true expert in explosives until you've dabbled in the fabric of reality itself. The class collectively decided that they were perfectly fine not being true experts in explosives. Thank you very much. The Floatians began to look longingly at the drains, wondering if they could liquefy themselves enough to escape. The Gaseous Ones were doing their best impression of an empty room, hoping that if they dispersed enough, they might avoid whatever fresh hell the professor had in store for them. Oblivious to the existential crisis he was causing, Professor Kaboom fiddled with the controls of the kaboominator 9000. The holographic display flickered and changed, now showing what looked like a swirling vortex of pure chaos. Behold, he announced with the pride of a parent showing off their child's first doomsday device, a simulated quantum singularity. Now, you might be thinking, but Professor, isn't it incredibly dangerous to mess around with the fundamental forces of the universe? And to that, I say absolutely. That's what makes it so much fun. The whisper from earlier, having apparently found a reserve of courage, or perhaps just resigned itself to its fate, squeaked out a question. Professor H, how does this relate to explosives? Professor Kaboom's helmet swiveled towards the tiny student, and even through the tinted visor, his manic grin was almost visible. An excellent question, my whisper-soft friend. You see, when it comes to explosives, we're not just limited to chemical reactions. Oh no, that's child's play. When you really want to make a bang, you need to think bigger, quantum bigger. He manipulated the controls, and the simulated singularity began to fluctuate wildly. Imagine harnessing the power of a collapsing star, compressing it into a space smaller than an atom, and then letting it loose. The energy released would make our little fusion reaction from earlier look like a damp firecracker. The class watched in horrified fascination as the holographic singularity pulsed and writhed. It was like staring into the abyss, if the abyss was having a seizure and was also on fire. Of course, Professor Kaboom continued, his voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. Working with exotic matter isn't without its risks. One wrong move and you could accidentally create a tear in the fabric of space-time. Or worse, you could wind up in a parallel universe where pineapple on pizza is considered a war crime. Trust me, I've been there. The food was terrible, but the explosions were spectacular. A Floatian, who had been slowly inching towards the door, paused mid-slither. Professor, are you saying you've actually traveled to parallel universes? Professor Kaboom waved a hand dismissively. Oh, sure, loads of times. It's a hazard of the job, really. You haven't lived until you've had to outrun antimatter explosion across multiple dimensions. Really puts the blast in dimensional blast radius. The class exchanged glances, silently wondering if they had somehow stumbled into a fever dream, or perhaps they were all already dead, and this was some bizarre form of cosmic punishment. But enough about my interdimensional mishaps, Professor Kaboom said, clapping his hands together with enough force to make several students jump. Let's move on to something really exciting, weaponized wormholes. The Granite student, whose rocky exterior was starting to show distinct signs of stress fractures, finally found its voice. Professor, I must protest. This all seems incredibly dangerous and frankly a bit insane. Surely the Galactic Federation wouldn't approve of such extreme teaching methods. Professor Kaboom tilted his head, considering the question. Well, my petrified pupil, you're not entirely wrong. The Galactic Federation does have some rather tedious regulations about safety and not accidentally destroying entire star systems, but here's the thing. They also recognize that in a universe as vast and unpredictable as ours, sometimes you need to fight fire with fire, or in our case, fight cosmic horrors with carefully controlled doses of utter chaos. He strode to the center of the room, arms spread wide. Think about it, class. Out there in the dark between the stars, there are things that make our little demonstrations look like a child's chemistry set. Gamma-ray bursts that could sterilize entire galaxies. Magnetars with fields strong enough to tear apart atoms from light years away. And let's not even get started on the void beasts of the Andromeda galaxy. Nasty pieces of work, those. The class listened in stunned silence, their earlier panic giving way to a sort of resigned awe. It was like watching a supernova up close, terrifying, yes, but also undeniably impressive. Our job, Professor Kaboom continued, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone, is to understand these forces, to respect them, yes, but also to harness them. Because let me tell you, when some eldritch abomination from beyond the galactic rim comes knocking, you'll be glad you know how to cobble together a makeshift reality bomb from nothing more than a broken vacuum cleaner and a particularly grumpy cat. A Gaseous One, who had been quietly condensing in the corner, suddenly spoke up. Professor, are you suggesting that we might one day need to use these techniques in actual combat? Professor Kaboom's helmet swiveled towards the gaseous student, and for a moment, the manic energy seemed to fade, replaced by something more somber. I sincerely hope not, my vaporous friend, but hope is a poor substitute for preparation. The universe is vast and full of wonders, yes, but it's also home to terrors beyond your wildest nightmares. And sometimes the only way to fight the dark is with a really, really big explosion. The class fell silent, each student lost in thought. The Floatians, who had been one loud noise away from liquefying entirely, began to solidify. The granites unclenched slightly, their crystalline structures relaxing. Even the Gaseous Ones seemed to gain a bit more definition, as if the weight of the professor's words had given them substance. But hey, Professor Kaboom said, his voice brightening, that's a problem for future you. For now, let's focus on the fun stuff. Who wants to see what happens when you introduce a quantum fluctuation to a pocket dimension? Before anyone could answer or run screaming from the room, he pressed another button on the kaboominator 9000. The holographic display erupted into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and non-Euclidean geometries. It was beautiful, terrifying, and gave everyone a slight headache just looking at it. Isn't it marvelous, Professor Kaboom exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. This, my dear students, is what happens when you tickle the universe's funny bone. One moment you're dealing with boring old three-dimensional space, and the next, bam, you're navigating an 11-dimensional manifold where time flows backwards and probability is more of a polite suggestion than a law. The whisper, who had been silent since its last question, suddenly piped up. Professor, is this what it's like to be human? Professor Kaboom paused, tilting his head in consideration. What, you mean existing in a constant state of awe, terror, and barely contained enthusiasm for things that could very well obliterate us at any moment, he chuckled. Yeah, that's pretty much humanity in a nutshell. Well, that and an inexplicable fondness for putting cheese on things that really shouldn't have cheese on them. The class nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning on them. Suddenly, the human penchant for exploration, innovation, and occasional bouts of seemingly suicidal recklessness made a bit more sense. When you evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill you, perhaps poking at the fundamental forces of the universe didn't seem quite so daunting. Now then, Professor Kaboom said, rubbing his hands together with glee, who's ready for some hands-on experience? The collective gasp of horror from the class was enough to set off the room's emergency ventilation system. Oh, relax, the professor chided, reaching for a nearby storage container. We'll start with something simple. Just a little nitroglycerin, some antimatter, and a dash of quantum foam. What could possibly go wrong? As Professor Kaboom began laying out an array of vials, containers, and what looked suspiciously like a child's chemistry set, the students exchanged glances. They had come to the Galactic Federation Academy expecting to learn about advanced sciences, interspecies diplomacy, and the finer points of cosmic navigation. Instead, they found themselves in a class that seemed to be equal parts advanced physics, mad science, and an elaborate suicide pact. But as they watched their human instructor cheerfully explaining the finer points of handling substances that could reduce planets to cosmic dust, they realized something important. In a universe full of wonders and horrors beyond imagination, sometimes the best defense was a really good offense. And who better to teach that than a species that had turned surviving the unsurvivable into an art form? With a collective deep breath, or whatever passed for breathing among the more exotic species, the class steeled themselves and leaned in. After all, if they were going to learn how to save the galaxy, they might as well do it with a bang. All right, class, Professor Kaboom announced, holding up a vial of something that seemed to be actively trying to escape its container. Let's make some magic happen. And remember, in the event of a sudden collapse of the local space-time continuum, please remain seated and keep your appendages inside the designated reality at all times. It's going to be one hell of a ride. And with that, the lesson truly began. As exotic matter swirled, quantum particles danced, and the very fabric of reality quivered in anticipation, one thing became abundantly clear. The galaxy might never be the same again, but it would certainly be a lot more interesting. In the back of the room, a small flame flickered to life. Whether from a stray spark or spontaneous combustion was anyone's guess. Professor Kaboom glanced at it, shrugged, and turned back to his eager, if slightly terrified, students. Now, who wants to learn how to juggle plasma? The adventures of Professor Kaboom and his class of reluctant demolitions experts were just beginning, and somewhere, in the vast expanse of the cosmos, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath, wondering what this motley crew of beings led by an enthusiastic human with a penchant for explosions would do next. One thing was certain, it was going to be one hell of a semester. As the semester progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The alien students, initially terrified of Professor Kaboom's unorthodox teaching methods, started to change. The Floatians developed a surprising resistance to sudden shocks, no longer liquefying at the slightest provocation. The Granites' crystalline structures became more flexible, adapting to the constant stress of near-death experiences. Even the Gaseous Ones learned to maintain their form in the face of reality-bending experiments. But the most significant change was in their mindset, where once they saw only danger and chaos, they began to see possibilities. The universe, with all its terrifying wonders, no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. On the last day of class, as the smoke cleared from their final practical exam, which may or may not have involved creating a miniature sun in the quad, Professor Kaboom addressed his students one last time. Well, my intrepid explorers of the explosive arts, we've come to the end of our journey together. You've laughed, you've cried, you've narrowly avoided being turned inside out by quantum fluctuations. But most importantly, you've learned. He paused, looking around the room at each student. The Floatian, who had once been a quivering mass of goo, now stood well, sort of tall and proud. The Granite, whose rocky exterior had been full of stress fractures, now gleamed with a polished sheen of confidence. The Gaseous Ones, once barely visible, now shimmered with a vibrant, swirling energy. You've learned that the universe is vast and terrifying, yes, but you've also learned that with knowledge, creativity, and a healthy disregard for the impossible, there's nothing you can't face. You came here as students of different species, but you're leaving as something more. You're leaving as innovators, problem solvers, and dare I say it, budding demolitions experts. A chuckle rippled through the class. It was a far cry from the nervous titters of their first day. But more than that, Professor Kaboom continued, his voice taking on a softer tone, "You're leaving as a team. A bizarre, probably should not exist, defies all laws of nature team, but a team nonetheless. And let me tell you, in all my years of blowing things up across multiple dimensions, I've never seen a force more powerful than that." The Whisper, who had grown considerably more vocal over the semester, spoke up. "Professor, what you've taught us. It goes beyond explosives, doesn't it?" Professor Kaboom's helmet tilted in what might have been a wink. "Ah, you've cottoned on, have you?" "Good, yes, my Whisper's soft friend. This class was never just about things that go boom. It was about facing the unknown, about pushing boundaries, about looking at the impossible and saying, 'Hold my hazmat suit, I've got an idea.'" He spread his arms wide, encompassing the entire class. "You see, the greatest explosive force in the universe isn't antimatter or quantum singularities or even my Aunt Edna's fruitcake. It's the power of a curious mind combined with an indomitable spirit. And let me tell you, after this semester, you've all got that in spades." The class sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, slowly, a smile spread across the face of the Granite student which, given its rocky composition, was quite a feat. "So, Professor," it rumbled, a mischievous glint in its crystalline eyes, "what you're saying is, we should go blow up the universe." Professor Kaboom threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "That's the spirit. Well, metaphorically speaking, of course. Maybe start with something smaller, like a moon, or a particularly annoying asteroid. Baby steps, you know." As the laughter died down, Professor Kaboom's voice took on a more serious tone. "But remember, with great power comes great responsibility, and also a really cool light show, but mostly the responsibility thing. Use what you've learned here wisely. Push the boundaries of what's possible, but always strive to build rather than destroy. Unless, of course, you really need to destroy something, in which case make it spectacular." The class erupted into cheers and applause, and in the case of the Gaseous Ones, a series of enthusiastic whooshes. As the noise died down, Professor Kaboom raised his hands for silence. "Now, for your final assignment," he paused dramatically, enjoying the mix of excitement and terror on his students' faces. "Go out there and make the universe a more interesting place. And if anyone asks where you learned to do, whatever it is you end up doing, just tell them it was all a terrible accident. It's worked for me so far." With a final round of laughter and a few tears, some of joy, some possibly from residual fear, the class filed out of the room. They were changed beings, carrying with them not just knowledge of exotic materials and improbable physics, but a new perspective on the universe and their place in it. As the last student left, Professor Kaboom looked around the empty classroom, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, he turned to the kaboominator 9000. "Well, old friend, looks like we've got the place to ourselves. What do you say we see if we can punch a hole through to that dimension where everything's made of cheese? I've got a hankering for some interdimensional fondue." And so, as a new batch of improbably trained students set out to shake up the galaxy, Professor Kaboom embarked on his own new adventure. Because in a universe full of wonders and terrors, the only sensible response was to dive in headfirst, preferably with a pocket full of antimatter and a really good pair of heat-resistant gloves. After all, that's the human way. And as the galaxy was quickly learning, the human way had a tendency to make things very, very interesting indeed. Or perhaps, just the beginning of a whole new kind of boom.